Hello and welcome to the second of 6 presentations in the Global Motivations Lecture Series. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live today or viewing the recording later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. The global rebalance of power continues. The ambitions, alliances, and actions of world powers have accelerated shifts in the international order that was framed in the waning days of the Second World War. What interests countries on the world stage today? What outcomes do they seek? And what role do cooperation and competition play? In the 6-part virtual series, we're painting a portrait of 6 world powers, their internal and external drivers, their evolving role in the community of nations, and what this means for the rest of the world. We hope you'll engage with us today as we explore the motivations of Russia. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share other IRC conversations as we consider a range of critical issues in the coming weeks. We're grateful to our sponsors who have made today's program and the Global Motivations Lecture Series possible. In particular, sustaining series sponsors Cyprian Simkowitz and Jerry White, and the University of St. Mary, and supporting series sponsor Burns and McDonnell. Thanks also to Global Conversation sponsors Nancy C. Messer and Holly Nielsen. Thank you for finding value in these conversations. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will help us to set the stage and introduce our speaker. IRC member Dr. Mark Wilcox is an associate professor at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. He's a retired U.S. Army officer with extensive professional and academic experience with the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. His 25-year military career included service in strategic counterintelligence assignments in the U.S. and Panama. He also performed political, military, diplomatic, and policy duties as a Eurasian foreign area officer in Germany, Russia, Uzbekistan, and Austria. He holds a doctorate in security studies from Kansas State University, a master's degree in Soviet and East European studies from the University of Kansas, and a Bachelor of Science degree in Foreign Service from Georgetown University. He's also an honor graduate of the U.S. Army Russia Institute in Garmisch, Germany. Mark, thank you so much for being with us today. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that introduction, and thank you to the IRC for making this event possible. Given what's been going on, certainly since February this year, but especially within the last week or so, this particular event is especially timely. So we look forward to the discussion today, and certainly are very honored and pleased to have our distinguished expert with us. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our distinguished expert, because she certainly has much greater insight to share than I could ever share with any of you. So Angela Stent is a senior advisor to the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies and professor emerita of government and foreign service at Georgetown University, Hoya Saxa. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and co-chairs its Hewett Forum on post-Soviet affairs. She has served as a national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council, in the Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department, and as a member of senior advisory panel for NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Angela's publications include From Embargo to Ostpolitik, The Political Economy of West German-Soviet Relations, 1955 to 1980, Russia and Germany Reborn, Unification, the Soviet Collapse and the New Europe, The Limits of Partnership, U.S.-Russian Relations in the 21st Century, and her latest book is Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest, originally published in 2019, but updated in September 22 in an ebook edition. I'd also like to mention that she recently participated in an event at Georgetown University just last week, honoring the diplomatic and academic legacy of Madeleine Albright. So Angela, it's absolutely wonderful to have you here with the International Relations Council. We very much look forward to your insights. And with that, I hand the virtual floor to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, IRC, for the invitation to address your members. I'm delighted to do so. And I'll just actually start off with one story from the symposium we had honoring Madeleine Albright, and that was when President Clinton was speaking. And he did tell us that in 2010, he met with Vladimir Putin, and Putin basically said to him, you know, we're not bound. He said, I'm not bound by the treaty that was signed, the agreement, the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. And the memorandum said we would respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. He said, I don't consider myself bound by that, and basically intimated to President Clinton what he was, you know, what he had in mind to do and what we've seen happening, of course, very much since February 24th this year, when Russia invaded Ukraine. I know that this is a series that has to do with motivations of great powers. So I just want to say a couple of words about why Putin has done this, what motivated him, and then about some of his miscalculations when he launched this war. And then I look forward to Mark's questions and questions from the audience. Putin has been determined, at least since 2014, to reverse the collapse of the Soviet Union. He said in 2005, famously, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And he has been determined to reverse that, to relitigate the end of the Cold War, and to question whether, in fact, the Soviet Union actually collapsed, looking legally at the documents. So he doesn't want to restore the Soviet Union per se. He sees himself much more in the tradition of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, whose portraits and statues he has in his office in the Kremlin, but really to restore his view of what the Russian Empire is. And he's likened himself recently to Peter the Great. And Peter the Great, of course, took the Baltic states after his defeat of Sweden in the early 18th century. And Putin has said, Peter took back lands that belonged to Russia, and that's what I'm doing. We need to take back lands that rightfully belong to us. So this is very much, you know, in many ways, an imperial war. It's trying to restore to Russia territories that Putin believes belong rightfully to Russia, and to create, actually, that was his goal at the beginning, at least, a new union of Slavic states, which would have been Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and possibly northern Kazakhstan. And so that's definitely been his mission. I'm reminded that he turned 70 on October 7th, on Friday, and he wanted this to be part of his legacy. But as we've seen just in the past couple of weeks, things really have not been going well for Russia in this invasion. The Ukrainians have successfully pushed back. They've taken territory in the northeastern region, Kharkiv, and other parts, and they now have another counteroffensive in the south, territory which Russia had taken since the invasion on February the 24th. In response, Putin has done something that most of us thought he wouldn't do, and that's to order a general mobilization. He calls it a partial mobilization of 300,000 soldiers, but it's sort of a mini general mobilization. And we thought he wouldn't do that because they're now trying to draft young men from the urban areas, educated people, middle-class people, people who are more likely to oppose this, as opposed to before, they were just drafting young men from the poorest regions of Russia, the benighted regions where they really don't have any prospects in life, and signing a contract to fight and being paid for it was one of them. And most of those people were ethnic minorities. They were not ethnic Russians. So by ordering this general mobilization, you've probably seen the photos of Russians trying to get out of Russia. The lines to get into Georgia, Kazakhstan are very long. And apparently 200,000 Russians have left just in the past couple of weeks to avoid general mobilization. Putin then, of course, held these sham referenda last week in 4 regions of Ukraine, He gave a fiery speech, which I'm happy to discuss in more detail on Friday, announcing the annexation of these territories, even though just today officials in Russia have admitted that they don't actually know where the borders of these newly annexed territories are, and they need to discuss it with the people who live there. And since he announced this annexation, the Ukrainians have taken back some territory that was in one of the regions that was announced to be annexed. So even that really isn't going very well for Russia. And so one really does have to ask oneself, why has this war not gone the way that Putin wanted it to? He believed that this was going to be a blitzkrieg, that within 72 hours of invading Ukraine, Russia would take the capital Kiev, install a pro-Russian government. And in fact, the officials the officers and the enlisted men who were involved in that initial invasion, they carried with them ceremonial uniforms to be worn in the victory parade that was to have happened a couple of weeks later. And instead, of course, when Ukraine celebrated its Independence Day some weeks ago, it did have a parade of Russian military hardware in Kiev, but those were all things that were captured from the Russians, who then left the area when they failed to conquer it. So what were the miscalculations that Putin had before and when he went into Ukraine and invaded Ukraine? And the first one was that he overestimated the Russian military strength. And I think many of us, even who are experts on this area, and I would include people in the US government, including the intelligence agencies, I think have been surprised by how poorly the Russian military has performed. There have been modernization reforms since 2008, and we just all thought that the Russian army was much more effective than it in fact has proven to be. And we now understand that the corruption that pervades all of Russian society and the political class, of course, pervades the military too. And much of the money that should have been spent on weapons, on training people, isn't there. And if you've seen any pictures of these newly mobilized men, they are being given Kalashnikovs, rifles that are rusted. I mean, the quality of the equipment is really quite poor and quite old. So the failure to perform well is what was a first miscalculation. The second one was Putin's underestimation of the ability of the Ukrainian military to fight back and of the determination of the Ukrainian people to defend their land and keep their nationhood and statehood. And Putin expected that Zelensky would flee when the Russian troops came in, and that the Ukrainians would surrender and maybe even welcome the Russians with open arms. This, of course, hasn't happened. 90% of the Ukrainian population today still says that they support prosecuting this war, even though casualties have been very high, until that they regain all of the territory, not only territory taken by Russia since February 24th, but in fact, the territory taken by Russia since 2014, including Crimea. The third miscalculation, I would say, was that Putin believed that the West was divided and would not rally together to push back against Russia. After all, if you look at what happened after the war with Georgia in 2008, when Russia recognized two entities as independent, and of course the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the launch of the war in the Donbass, the Western reaction really wasn't very strong. Yes, there were some sanctions in 2014, but more or less business as usual continued. And of course, Putin looked back on the 4 years of the administration of Donald Trump and saw a US-European relationship that was really quite fragile. And even you had an American president who wanted at one point the United States to pull out of NATO. Well, he was wrong in that. Western unity has proven very strong and resilient, led, of course, by the United States, but with all of the European countries joining in and also our Asian allies. Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, even Switzerland has now imposed sanctions on Russia. So this was unexpected, and that Western unity is still holding. We can obviously talk about that more in the question and answer period, how long, but it's proven very resilient. And I think the fourth miscalculation was that Putin, the Soviet Union and particularly post-Soviet Russia have been very important energy suppliers to Europe. They've been important trading partners for Europe. And frankly, I think people in the Kremlin believed that most Europeans were far too invested in their economic and specifically energy relationship with Russia, particularly countries like Germany, Italy, that were getting, up to 50% of their energy from Russia, that these countries would not join in sanctions and would not threaten their own societies with the loss of Russian energy supplies. Well, of course, they've done it, and the energy situation is quite dire, really, in Europe today, partly because of what Russia has done. But Russia will emerge from this war no longer as an energy superpower. And so that, I think, was another major miscalculation on Putin's part. And so I think the final question I just want to leave just in these opening remarks is, what Putin is unwilling to accept, as I said at the very beginning, is that the Soviet Union collapsed and that at some point Russia must become a post-imperial power. In the 20th century, obviously, you've had the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, French, and British empires. None of these countries wanted to accept it at the beginning, but they did in the end. And they've made post-imperial transitions. Putin seems to believe in this view of Russian exceptionalism, that Russia is destined always to be an empire, and that defensive expansionism, in other words, gobbling up territories because Russia has few natural borders, really only in the north, that is Russia's destiny, that it must always do that, otherwise it's vulnerable. And so the question is Russia then going to be the exception to the rule that all empires in the end do disintegrate and countries move on? So far, he shows no sign of being willing to do that. And therefore, we see him insisting on persecuting this war, even though it's really not going the way Russia had wanted it to go. So let me stop, and I look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Angela, for those remarks. Lots of food for thought there, and a very, very good summary of your current assessment of what's going on. I would point out to our participants, if they want to get more detail on Angela's remarks, go to the website of Foreign Policy, and you can find them there, because it's a very, very worthwhile read and worthwhile for our thinking. As we look at this whole concept of sort of a foundering imperial project, it certainly seems that there are some rumblings outside of Ukraine that may also indicate that other parts of the former Soviet Union may be looking at taking a more independent course, thinking especially of Kazakhstan, which has certainly not endorsed what's going on in Ukraine, and even the resumption of hostilities in Nagorno-Karabakh, with perhaps the Azerbaijanis taking advantage of Russia's distraction in Ukraine. I wonder if you could comment on those issues and how this might be expanding beyond Ukraine.
Sure. So this is another unintended consequence of Russia's war in Ukraine. I mentioned at the beginning that the kind of idea of a Slavic Union, and this goes back to something that Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote about, could include northern Kazakhstan, where you have a large percentage of the population is Slavic. Now, what's very interesting about Kazakhstan is that until this year, Kazakhstan has very carefully balanced its relationship with China and Russia and the United States as well. China being a major investor, Kazakhstan's part of the Belt and Road, Russia being or seeing itself as a security provider, and the US as an important partner also. Now, in January of this year, there was political unrest in Kazakhstan, and the current president, Tokayev, asked Russia if it could mobilize troops from the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is the kind of post-Soviet military, I guess it's an alliance, but it's really not an equivalent of NATO, but it is a military alliance. It doesn't have an Article 5 guarantee, though. He asked whether troops could come and help restore order there. And in fact, Russia did send troops to Kazakhstan for a limited amount of time, and they helped restore order. And most people thought, well, Kazakhstan now has another reason to be grateful to Russia and also to be more dependent on Russia, because without these troops, maybe President Tokayev would have had a more difficult time. Anyway, we have seen that that is not the case. The specter of Russia marching in and taking over, trying to take over more territory in Ukraine has really revived real concerns in Kazakhstan about Russian designs, possibly on northern Kazakhstan. And in general, it's also aroused among the population in Kazakhstan all kinds of questions about Russia as a colonial power. And they're looking back at their history and realizing that, you know, they were colonized by Russians, and that the way the Russians have treated them in the past is also more like colonial subjects. And for all of these reasons, Tokayev has taken an independent stance. He told Putin flat out, I'm not going to recognize the independence of the Donbas republics. This is before the latest referendums were held. He told Putin that before. He has, you know, Kazakhstan has not, you know, has not really recognized anything that Russia is doing in Ukraine as being legitimate. And at the latest summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a regional organization of Central Asian states, plus Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and I guess Iran is about to join. At this regional summit a couple of weeks ago, it was notable that Putin was treated in a rather distanced way by a number of these countries. In fact, they were kind of getting their revenge back on him. Interestingly, President Xi Jinping flew to Kazakhstan first, and he met with the Kazakh president, who speaks Chinese fluently. And then he went on to the summit in Samarkand. This is also, I think, an important gesture going there first, because China sees itself as the potential beneficiary from the greater estrangement between Russia and some of the Central Asian countries. But a number of the Central Asian leaders kept Putin waiting. And Putin, of course, famously keeps everybody waiting, but he does not like to be kept waiting. And even if it was only 5-10 minutes, it's still, and President Erdogan kept him waiting too there, it's still symbolic that these countries are finally saying, given how badly things are going in Ukraine and given this unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, we really are keeping our distance now. So I think as a result of this war, all of the countries of Central Asia are rethinking their relationship with Russia. Obviously, if given the geography, they will be interacting with Russia, but trying to find more options and frankly, looking more to China.
It would certainly appear that one of the other miscalculations Putin made was certainly references his relationship without limits with China, which appears to be having some limits at this point. But I was also wondering, as we look at, you know, an imperial project, and we've seen some talk about this whole philosophy of Eurasianism, and does Putin buy into Eurasianism? Is there some philosophical or ideological basis for what he's doing, or is this more aimed at, say, keeping Putin in power and building his own domestic base?
You know, it's an excellent question, and with all these things, it's very hard to know exactly, you know, how much weight to give to different factors. Clearly, this is about keeping him in power. Although one could argue he really didn't have to start the war to keep himself in power, because, you know, it didn't look as if anyone was really challenging him then. But it is about keeping him in power. But I do think, and I've heard him express these views in these Valdai International Discussion Club meetings that I've been to over the years. This is a forum once a year where the Russians, you know, brought and still do bring, but not from the West anymore, foreign experts on Russia, and we would have discussions with Russian colleagues, and then we would meet with President Putin. So he certainly talks about the idea of Eurasianism, about Russia's special destiny, that it's both part of Europe and part of Asia, and its Eurasian civilization is superior to everyone else's. I mean, that's certainly what he articulates, and he may well believe. But I think the motivation for what he's doing is really less of a set of philosophical beliefs And by the way, he quoted at the very end of his speech on Friday, where he announced the referenda, the philosopher Ivan Ilyin, who apparently is someone whom he does read. This is someone who left the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution, was a conservative, also believed in some of these Eurasianist and monarchist ideas. So to some extent, he may really believe this, but I think it's also the practical idea that he really does apparently has convinced himself that it is his destiny as the leader of Russia, from the ashes of what happened after the Soviet collapse, to then take back some of these territories.
So interesting that they're, with that, the whole philosophical basis is kind of, because a bit of it cuts to the point of how does he build support for what he's doing? I mean, obviously he has a very significant repressive apparatus that can, well, basically say, I don't need to build support. But of course, we see now with all the discomfort of people fleeing the country over the mobilization, we're beginning to see more and more indications there may be some sort of domestic opposition arising. So I was wondering if you could comment, do you see a genuine and potentially, I don't know what's the word to say, I wouldn't say powerful opposition, but actionable opposition happening? And have you seen any credible polling data that might give us a gauge on how much opposition there is to Putin at this time?
Yes, so I think before he ordered the mobilization, 300,000 Russians had left since the beginning of the war. So a lot of the people who opposed the war, younger people, but not only younger people, people also with skills that they can use in the West, but a significant number of people who opposed the war have left Russia. Those who remain, I would say before the mobilization, were largely divided into, I think, very small groups of people who actively opposed it. And then the vast majority, and here the polling by the independent Levada organization, I think, is the best one, that showed that about half of the Russian population, and I'm talking about now, this is 2 or 3 weeks ago, had kind of just shut the war out of their minds. They were living their lives as they normally do, and they were kind of indifferent to it. And the mobilization has changed that now, because it's much harder to be somebody. I was on a call today with someone who said, the war began for many Russians just 2 weeks ago when they started this mobilization. So I haven't seen polling data since then, but as I say, before then, what the majority was trying to do was just to kind of separate themselves from it. But public opinion polls, I saw one today, and everything's very contradictory. 60% of the population said they would support, attacking Kiev again, and then 73% said they'd support ending the war. So a lot of Russians only get their information from state-run media. And for them, they're fed a steady diet of, this is a threat from NATO, it's a threat to Russia, they're trying to starve us out, they're trying to cut us off, they're neo-Nazis they're Nazis in Ukraine, although we haven't heard that recently. You pick your explanation for it, and they're fed a steady diet of this, and therefore they tend to support the war. And also the kind of anti-Western narrative, and you heard it in spades on Friday in Putin's speech, does still get traction among the Russian people. So the movement that opposes the war is there inside Russia, but it's small. And at the moment, I don't think it has any traction to change what's happening there. Alexei Navalny, who's a leading opposition figure, is in solitary confinement. He manages to meet with his lawyers. They take notes and then they publish what he's saying to them. And he's obviously criticized the war. He's now calling for a parliamentary system of government. That's something else. But I mean, he's, again, most of his people, his followers have left Russia because otherwise they'd be in jail. Then, a significant number of people have been jailed since the beginning of the war because they opposed it. So we're not there yet. Interestingly, there was a large opposition to mobilization movement in Dagestan, one of the Muslim republics of the North Caucasus. And so this comes back again to the resentment among non-ethnic Russians that they're being disproportionately drafted and sent to die in Ukraine. But that was just in one republic, constituent republic of the Russian Federation. So I think we shouldn't be under any illusions that we're going to see a popular movement anytime soon overthrow the government.
The point you raised about what happened in Dagestan, and I think there's also been taking place some protests up in the Buryat region as well, where you have ethnic minorities perhaps serving a little bit disproportionately greater than other Russians.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how that would play for Putin, because he's trying to also build this effort to pit the West against the rest, or actually the rest against the West, particularly reaching out to, say, populations in Africa and the Middle East. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, and whether this perception that non-Russian ethnic minorities are serving more proportionally greater in the war, if that plays a role in his building these relations with the rest.
So, I mean, he's definitely, again, if you listen to the speech on Friday, it was almost kind of like a classic Soviet apparatchik, because he went back to the kind of Soviet narrative of the United States and the West. They're imperialists, they're colonialists, they've oppressed us. We, the Soviet Union, and we, Russia, well, we, the Soviet Union, were on the side of national liberation. We were the ones, you know, who helped you liberate yourself from Western colonialism. So he's trying to appeal still to the rest of the world, and most of the global South has not condemned Russia, nor has it put any sanctions on Russia. It's trying to remain neutral. And, you know, India is a very interesting case here, because India and the Soviet Union had a long relationship going back to the Cold War years, when India was a major non-aligned leader. And yet India is also, of course, a partner of the United States in the Quad, which includes Japan and Australia as well. And India is a democracy, but India has not condemned what Russia's doing. But we saw at this SCO summit in Samarkand that I was talking about, Prime Minister Modi publicly chastising Putin and saying this is not the time for war. And I told you so on several occasions. But India also abstained in the United Nations Security Council vote that's just taken place, you know, condemning the referenda. So he's trying to appeal also to countries like India, again, with its own colonial past. And so far, I think Russia has done pretty well in this. The global South is still remaining neutral and sort of and not joining the West in condemning Russia. I'm not sure how much the fact that there's this disproportionate drafting of ethnic minorities has really penetrated in many parts of the world. I don't know if they've focused on that, but certainly groups representing those ethnic minorities that live in exile, that don't live in Russia, they're certainly trying to publicize that. But I think those connections haven't quite been made yet.
Okay, You've mentioned Putin's speech several times and said we can certainly return to it. So I'll return to it. So I was wondering specifically, was there anything that he said that really surprised you? And opening that aperture a little more broadly, is there anything that he has said or done, say the last 2 or 3 weeks when things have started going quite badly for him, that are changing your perceptions of Vladimir Putin?
Well, so the speech was certainly a rendition of Putin's greatest grievance hits. I mean, all of the grievances that we've heard from him over the years. It was just the packaging was somewhat different, but certainly, you know, this criticism of the West, I would say it was more sharply anti-American, particularly, than previous speeches. Although, I mean, you could go back to the Munich Security Conference speech in 2007, where he said some of he just said it in more detail and sort of really honed in on the kind of imperialism and colonialism and, you know, corrupt capitalism also, you know, in that speech. Then the other part of this, another part of the speech had to do with the criticism of Western wokeness. I've heard him say that before. That's nothing new, but he did it sort of, again, on steroids, if you like. And then obviously justifying everything that he'd done. What I think is new is when he talked about the United States being the only power to have used atomic weapons on Japan in 1945 and saying the US set a precedent. And so now you used to hear from Putin, yes, we're a nuclear power, but we're a responsible power. More recently, obviously, we've had these implied threats from him. For instance, now that Kherson region is formally annexed to Russia, according to him. You know, if the Ukrainian troops push back as they're doing in Kherson and maybe take some more territory there, Putin could say, this is now an attack on Mother Russia, and we use all means to defend our territory, including possibly the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. So the threats of escalation and the thinly veiled threats of the potential of using a nuclear weapon are new. They were implicitly there before the war started, but it's I think become more explicit now, and it certainly has people in this country and other parts of the collective West sort of really thinking about what that means. So I would say that was probably a new accent. But you know, I have to say, Putin kept, as I said, Putin likes to keep people waiting, or he does. So he kept, everybody was sitting in the room, if you watch the video of the speech, for I think 25 minutes waiting for him to come in. And just looking at the expressions on the faces of all of his closest colleagues, I mean, they looked bored, they were looking down. And even when he was speaking, there was no enthusiasm there. It was as if they were going through the motions. Yes, they had to clap him and stand up. But this is different from when Crimea was annexed in 2014, where you really felt this patriotic support for Putin. And yes, Crimea is ours, and it always was. It's not there anymore.
That is fascinating that you described how everybody looked. I remember watching the video that they posted when he went around the room with the Security Council to everybody say, do you support the annexation? And it was like watching a bunch of schoolboys and schoolgirls sitting there bored and being chastised by their teacher.
And being chastised, exactly.
It was, but you know, that's interesting. It was quickly tied to the issue of nuclear weapons. And I've had a couple of questions come out on that too. And of course, we heard Secretary of Defense Austin made a comment yesterday. Well, basically Putin, he's a decision maker. He has no limits. I'll put you on the spot, ask you to speculate the possibility that they actually will use nuclear weapons. And I'm wondering also in that context, might this be an occasion where someone within the government, say the defense minister, someone else is going to say, no, we are not going to do this. And they might intervene to block his decision.
Yeah, so I mean, as far as I understand it, and I don't know what your understanding is, Putin can't just press the button. Now, having said that, my understanding is if you're talking about a strategic nuclear weapon, in other words, a weapon that could reach the United States, there's a process. You know, a number of people have to sign off on this. You can't just, it's not an individual that can do it. It's obviously the same in this country too. But I have been told that for these low yield tactical nuclear weapons, there isn't necessarily a procedure for how you sort of decide what's the chain of command in deciding whether to use one. So theoretically, there are other people involved in this. And theoretically, of course, someone could maybe intervene and say, no, we're not going to do this. But that, of course, would mean tantamount to, you know, enough people agreeing with this that they would then have to essentially get rid of Putin. Other people would argue that, you know, the way the power is structured in Russia, the other people in the chain of command really wouldn't have any choice if he said to them, we're going to do this. So this is an open question here. You know, logically, you would have to ask yourself, what is the point, the utility of using or deploying a low yield tactical nuclear weapon? You're not going to get territory from that. Of course, it may, you know, you would harm the Ukrainian soldiers and you would set back their war effort, but you would also unleash, you know, radiation that not only affects Ukraine, but could affect Russia, you know, the other neighboring states. I mean, depending on, you know, where it's done and which way the wind is blowing. Some people are now speculating that they might test one of their new nuclear weapons, do a test as a sort of warning. I mean, Putin's trying to do this to intimidate the Ukrainians and the West to stop, the West to stop supporting Ukraine and the Ukrainians to stop fighting. And so to actually do a nuclear test, even if you didn't sort of deploy the weapon somehow, would already be an escalation. I mean, this would be breaking a taboo, obviously, that's 77 years old. So right now, I don't think that the likelihood is that great. I think what Secretary Austin said is what Putin said is, Putin says, I'm not bluffing. He may be seriously thinking about this. I think some people think it might be more likely later on if the war, you know, continues to go badly, but you cannot discount it. And that's why I think, you know, our administration, apparently, if you listen to what Jake Sullivan and others are saying, has been very clear, sending very clear messages to the Kremlin that there will be very severe consequences. And I guess General Petraeus on one of the Sunday shows was quite explicit about what he thought that might involve, which would be hitting actual Russian military targets. So, I mean, who knows? No one's going to be explicit about this, but that's the other facet of this, is for the US at least to use whatever means of deterrence it has to persuade the Russians that if they were to do something like this, the consequences would be very serious.
And that would certainly then bring NATO in and create a host of other complications. And speaking of NATO, I mean, we're looking at our European allies and partners. And you pointed out that one of his miscalculations was that that the Europeans would not sanction him, not support those sanctions. As we move towards winter and we look at energy prospects, and as we look at elections taking place in Europe, in Italy and other places, for example, do you think there is a risk that unity is going to start to fracture in the coming months?
I think that risk is definitely there. You've had this election in Italy where you now have a coalition of the extreme right really coming to power. The woman who I guess is going to be prime minister, if she has a cabinet together, has said that she personally supports Ukraine, but there are other people in that coalition, including Silvio Berlusconi, known to be a close associate of Putin's, that have a different view. You've also seen in the Czech Republic now, for a second day at the weekend, protests about food prices, about energy prices, about inflation, and people saying, we should, you know, let's unsanction Russia. Let's change our policy toward Russia because, you know, we want to have heat and electricity this winter and we want to be able to buy food. And you've seen some, you know, protests in other countries about that too. There's an interesting article in the New York Times today about a little town which is right where the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which recently experienced a series of explosions, where it goes to, and interviewing people there saying, you know, why shouldn't we have a better relationship with Russia? We need the energy, you know, is this our fight? Now, in Germany, 70% of the population still support the support of Ukraine, and European publics in general are still pretty much in favor of supporting Ukraine. You know, every time more atrocities are revealed of what the Russians have done, and including, by the way, the threats that Putin makes, this tends to solidify support in Europe. But we can't, you know, get away from the fact that energy prices are sky high, particularly in Europe, that Russian energy is actually not really available very much anymore, and that people are facing the prospect of a cold winter. The Germans are already, you know, turning down their thermostats and taking shorter showers. That's what they've been told to do. In other words, preemptively trying to take measures to insulate themselves. And the German government, for instance, is now able to get some alternative supplies of energy from other places, the Middle East, Azerbaijan, US LNG, potentially. But still, I think it's too early to say, you know, whether by December you'll still have such a solid European support for Ukraine, and you won't have more Europeans argue that maybe we should rethink our sanctions against Russia. Although, of course, I'm not sure that a lot of Russian energy will be available anyway if they wanted to do it, given what's been happening.
And certainly one of the means, or one of the ways that the Europeans have been supporting, is by taking in refugees from Ukraine. And now, of course, we see the large movement of Russian draft evaders, if you will, heading into say Georgia and places like that. I've had a couple of questions on that. One, is there a potential national security threat to, say, Georgia with all these Russians flowing in? And a related question, should Europe block or welcome these draft dodgers coming out of Russia?
So this is a big debate in Europe. And even the Georgians, I mean, they are welcoming the Russians. The Armenians have as well, by the way. Kazakhstan is. But there has been a debate in these countries about, how do we know whether all these Russians are in fact opponents of this? Could it be a way for the Russian government to get people in here who would undermine? I mean, Georgia has a complicated relationship with Russia because, of course, Russia occupies two territories there, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And there's a territorial dispute. You have a Georgian government that is sort of trying to balance different things. What's been very interesting about this is looking at the EU debate on this. So the three Baltic states and now Finland have basically said that they're not going to let in any more Russian tourists. And they're also, I'm not sure whether they've actually differentiated between that and draft dodgers or, people who don't want to be mobilized, but they're closing off their countries to letting any more Russians in. And some other EU countries are moving towards that, and then other ones are saying, no, we should be welcoming these people who oppose the war. So that is a very big debate going on. As you say, a number of European countries, including Germany, have taken a large number of Ukrainian refugees, for instance, and also Russian refugees earlier on in the war. And there is a debate about how many more Russians they should take. So I think I don't have a good answer for that, because I understand those countries that are concerned about having too many Russians there whose real views and purposes they don't know, and others who say we should be encouraging them and encouraging people who could form an alternative to the Putin government.
One of the countries which has taken in a particular group of people from Ukraine is Turkey, who apparently the commanders of the Azov battalion will be spending the rest of the conflict sitting in Turkey, much to the chagrin of some Russians. Which
although some were returned, right? Turkey was also involved in returning some of them to Ukraine.
Yes, yeah, but I guess the commanders are going to sit there and enjoy their Turkish vacation, I guess, is one Russian critic said. But I was wondering if we could turn to Turkey a little bit. You mentioned Turkey earlier, and Turkey has a unique relationship with Russia, being grounded both in NATO and cultivating a relationship with Russia. So I wonder if you could comment on where do you see Turkey and Erdogan specifically continue to play a role in this whole dynamic we see right now?
Yeah, well, this dynamic has really afforded Turkey the opportunity to be a key player here and have leverage, which is, of course, one of the things that President Erdogan really wants, restore Ottoman power. And of course, he does also have an election coming up, I guess, next year. So Turkey, it is a unique relationship. Turkey is a NATO member, a difficult NATO member, but it's a NATO member. It also has cultivated relations with Russia. It's been on opposite sides of conflicts with Russia, particularly in Syria, but still has worked with Russia there. It's also now one of the providing forces as peacekeepers in the Nagorno-Karabakh dispute, although, as you rightly said, recently there's been a flare-up of hostilities there, but they are now a player in Russia's backyard. But the other thing is that Turkey has strong relations with Ukraine. The Turks have been providing drones to the Ukrainians even before this war broke out, but in the previous conflict just since 2014. Erdogan has gone to Ukraine. He said Crimea is Ukrainian, and he has definitely, enjoyed good relations with President Zelensky. So what we had was in March and early April, Turkey really brokered peace talks between Russians and Ukrainians, and there were some other people involved too. And it looked as if by early April, they'd come to at least a tentative agreement whereby Russia would return to where it was, Russian troops, before February 24th. In other words, Russia would hold on to the territory it had taken between 2014 and February the 24th, but it would give up the extra territory. And Ukraine would agree to remain neutral, not to seek NATO membership, but also to have security guarantees from a number of different countries, security guarantees that almost amount to Article 5 guarantees, but anyway, have security guarantees. And then what happened was the massacres in Bucha, the suburb of Kiev, were discovered. And for various other reasons, this peace plan never went anywhere, even though President Erdogan, really until last week, until the referenda, was saying we should revive these talks. He said Putin wants to negotiate. So he's still putting himself forward as a key figure. He was also important in brokering the deal that enabled grain to be exported, because the Russians had been blocking all these grain exports from Ukraine. And Erdogan, working with the United Nations and other bodies, was able to free that up. The Russians have now threatened to withdraw from that agreement, but so far they haven't. So he is playing this important role. But it's difficult for him now because, I don't think peace negotiations look very far away. But he's still there as a broker. And as we just mentioned, he helped negotiate a significant prisoner exchange just a couple of weeks ago, and he will continue to do that.
So it seemed like the prospects for negotiated settlement are quite grim at this time. Can you envision a set of conditions that would produce, or at least start to lead to, a negotiated settlement right now?
Well, first of all, if President Zelensky were to negotiate at this point anything but Russia withdrawing not only to where it was on February 23rd, but beyond that, then he's out of power. His government would fall. And this is not something that the Ukrainian people would support. Would Putin be, some people believe that by announcing these referenda, Putin would now say, okay, well, we've taken more territory. Now we'll sit down with the Ukrainians and we'll come to some ceasefire agreement. I mean, any agreement like that is only going to be temporary, because as long as Putin's in power, his goal of taking over all of Ukraine isn't going to go away. But you could see a time, when, where there was a ceasefire and maybe, for some period of time, there weren't active hostilities there. But that, another circumstance under which you could envisage negotiations is if Russia really were defeated. But, everybody goes around saying Putin can't lose. Well, if there's a war, usually somebody does lose. But, at the moment, obviously, he wouldn't be willing to admit that. But the prospect of negotiation seems really quite far off at the moment.
And again, it all seems to come around, as things do when we talk about this, to Putin himself. And obviously, perhaps another circumstance under which negotiated settlement might take place is he is no longer in power, which kind of gets around to, I think, maybe my last question to you. When it gets down to succession, is there a succession plan, or how do you see succession possibly playing out for Putin? And is there a prospect of regime change?
So technically, if something were to happen to Putin, the prime minister, Mikhail Mishustin, would become temporary president, and then there'd be elections in, I think it's 3 months. Mishustin is the prime minister. He's a technocrat, and he belongs to that group of people in the ruling elite who are younger, younger than, Putin, as I said, is about to turn 70, people in their 50s mainly, maybe slightly older, but who are much more focused on the Russian economy, and who would probably agree that, going to war, it has really not been good for the Russian economy, particularly with the sanctions, and that what Russia should try and do is to get back to a situation where it has tolerable relations with the West, and it can focus on modernizing its own economy, which it really hasn't done under Putin. So that strata of people is there. Putin has been assiduously careful not to name a successor or to be a lame duck. So as far as we know, there is no named successor. Names that used to come up were Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister. I think that's a little bit more difficult now, given what's happened in the war. And also, he's not fully ethnically Russian. He's a Tuva ethnically, and that would be something different in Russian history. Sergei Kiriyenko, who was a former prime minister at a very young age in 1999, and then headed Rosatom, the nuclear energy part of the Russian government, and is now a deputy presidential administration official, and who has been actually doing a lot in this conflict going to Ukraine. He could be a potential successor. But there's no one obvious, as I say. I mean, there are people used to think maybe the mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin. I haven't seen his name mentioned lately. So if something were to happen to Putin, my prediction would be unexpected, right? My prediction would be that there would be a power struggle, because I don't think that there's a succession plan worked out. If any of you have not seen the marvelous movie Death of Stalin, go see it. You know, that shows you in a comic form what happened after Stalin died. But I do think that there would be a succession struggle, because it's not clear that any one particular individual would have the support of other individuals. You could have a collective leadership for a time being, which is sort of what you had when Stalin died, but still there would be a struggle. Now, you know, another potential scenario is the Khrushchev scenario, where you have a group of officials getting together and saying, this guy's no good anymore, we need a different leader. But at that point in the Soviet Union, you had institutions. So you had a central committee of the Communist Party, and you did have a Politburo, and these people came together and agreed, we're going to get rid of Khrushchev and we'll have collective rule. That's when Mr. Brezhnev came in with some others. And that worked. I'm not so sure that that's what's happening now. Obviously, any of this would be behind the scenes, but this is such a highly personalistic system that the institutions, you know, really don't count for very much. And so they couldn't get together and say, we as a group from the Central Committee, which no longer exists, you know, have decided we voted you out. But that's always a possibility. Some people have, you know, talked about, well, it goes back to your scenario about ordering the use of a nuclear weapon. Would the military turn on him? It's, you know, in Russian history, leaders have been very careful not to let the military get too much into politics. You know, all those things are possible, you know, as a way. Or Putin could decide in 2024 that he's not running anymore, because he can run for president again. But in that case, he would have to have a deal worked out, as Yeltsin worked out when he resigned, that nothing's going to happen to Putin and his family, that all their assets would be protected, but also that the people who surround him, his inner circle, all their assets will be protected as well. I'm not sure that anyone is in a position today or even in 2024 to guarantee that, given everything that's happened and given you know, the inter-elite cleavages that we believe exist. So in other words, we can put forward all these scenarios, but it's difficult to see, you know, which one would obtain, and the kind of voluntarily leaving power seems less likely now than it would have been before the war.
All right, and that's probably an appropriate way to conclude with sort of a number of potential futures. Don't know what they are. Stay tuned and we'll see what happens. Angela, thank you so much for all your comments, covering a wide range of issues. Matthew, back over to you, sir.
Dr. Stent, Dr. Wilcox, thank you so much for such a meaningful look at a really complex situation. Dr. Stent, as I think you pointed out very well, there is a lot going on beyond even Ukraine, right, for us to consider when it comes to Russia and when it comes to the person of Vladimir Putin. So we really appreciate the insights that you have shared with us, and obviously we will continue to watch this unfolding situation. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this second installment in the Global Motivation series. We'll be continuing soon with other looks at other world powers and what really drives them in the world. And maybe we'll come to some greater clarity by the end of the series. But we certainly appreciate your continued engagement. Dr. Stent, Dr. Wilcox, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all very soon.
Thank you.